I don't think there is a history of Northeast. History of Northeast is something that is a history of convenience, right?
Mm,
It's something that was made by colonial officers, by after independence,
mm,
officials from probably other parts of the country, and you had officials from pre-existing provinces like Assam,
mm.
right? Who sort of, in order to you know, for administrative convenience, they sort of made the entire province into one region, right?
Mm,
And
mm.
those aftermaths, those consequences, we are still suffering even today, right? My name is Shivangi, and I hail from Guwahati, in Assam, in Northeast India. I've been born and brought up in Guwahati, and I did my schooling and everything from the city, and it was, I think, for my undergraduate studies that I went to Delhi, and that was the first time I became a migrant student in Delhi.
Mm,
And then I did my master's also from Delhi, and then I started thinking about doing research, thinking about, sort of talking to as many people as possible. And I think, in a way, I am still trying to understand how to introduce or to define myself. But I think for the listeners, all I can say is that right now I am based in Guwahati for the time being. But
mm,
yes, that's all. It's a very short introduction.
mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, why don't we talk about your research, where you are doing your research, and some little things about your research, particularly your key features, your keywords, or what are the things that you are interested in your research, kind of thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we talked about earlier, because of confidentiality and ethics regulation, I'm not
Mm,
able to delve deep into my research at the moment, because
mm,
I also have to protect the students who very kindly consented to collaborate with me. But I think all I can say right now is I am interested in looking at associational life, how different associations, different bodies representing communities in metropolitan cities
mm,
uh, able to bring students together.
mm,
And of course, I am an outsider, and there are, in many cases, I also, to a certain extent, I experienced language barriers. But
mm,
I think to a great extent, I mean, it was a huge eye opener, because for a lot of, like, until before, I was aware of the literature that was coming out based on the experiences
mm,
of migrant students, especially in the aftermath of, the unfortunate death of Nido Tanyam in 2014. And that was also the time when I was a student here in Delhi. And then, after his unfortunate death, a lot of students, activists, and a lot of writers who were from the different states of the region started writing about these issues. And also, a lot of students started forming associations, they started forming forums to talk about these issues. And I think, as an outsider, obviously I won't be commenting on them, because my lived experiences are different,
mm,
because probably because of the way I look, I was spared that, I was spared being racialized on the streets of Delhi. But that wasn't the case for a lot of my friends and a lot of students who hailed from other communities. So what I did was I engaged with those literature, with how people were thinking and interpreting these issues, because obviously that is closely linked to who is an Indian, right, and
mm,
what defines citizenship in the country. Because as someone who is hailing from Nagaland, you are aware of the history of the different movements and
mm,
how the state has tried to oppress them. So I think there is a genealogy of oppression right there. Right, the
mm,
power struggle is the power is very much tipped in the favor of the Indian state. Right. So I
mm,
think these were some of the things that I initially engaged with, but I think later on I also realized that students, I mean, even before I sort of tried and tried to sort of think about them, students had already started thinking about them way before
mm,
I did this, right? Way before I thought. So there were these forums, movements, organizations. I apologize, I can't name them at the moment, but there was already a sort of thinking that was emerging from within communities, and there were relationships, there were networks which helped a lot of young women and men and people identifying with different sexualities to survive and to find their footing in Delhi. And this is what I am currently looking at. But obviously, it has been whatever I have been able to understand. It has been possible because students, some of them were willing to share their experiences, which also says a lot. Yeah.
So you said that like you are also a migrant in the sense you are not
Yeah.
in your home city or in your homeland, but you migrate to a different place to study. Same as me. I'm also studying in a place where in a different place. So I want to understand how do you define migrations, and also like if you can give me some kind of history on migrations, the significance of migration, why migration is important, or say the impact of migration, what history says about migrations, what today's context says about migrations, and what are the significance or the impact that migration have on humanity. Because somehow if I understand migrations in a right way, for me as a person who is interested in economic development, into human greatness in an overall level, or say on a bigger picture, if we think of any great civilization, it's because of migrations. People migrated from different places to a better favorable environments, to build communities, to strive for a new living. Say suppose if you think of America, the United States of America, like most of the people, the American citizens are migrants from different part of the world, right? So if we see in the economic terms, if we see in the greater human civilizations, I see migration is a good thing. And like that's the reason I want to understand on your point of view, what do you see, how do you define migrations, its history, significance, and impact to today's world?
Okay, that's a very huge question, to be honest. But I'll definitely try to engage with it. So, see, when we talk about migration, one thing I mean, a very commonplace understanding of it would be you are moving to a new place, right? Whether it is within a new country or within the same country, whether it is in the context of India, it can be interstate migration, like you and me, right? Within the same country, to Delhi and then Karnataka. And then you have immigration, which is like inter-country migration, right? You go to a new country and then you find citizenship. I think, but migration, I think in a way, even though there are technicalities of understanding migration, but it is also a very fluid, right? It is also a very dynamic concept, because for all of us, it is something very, very different, right? And it's also a very important concept because, as I said earlier, citizenship is also, very intricately linked with migration. Like, say, for instance, in the context of Assam, all of us know what is happening with the National Registry of Citizens, or the NRC movements. And in Assam, I see a huge tension of defining who is an outsider and who is an insider. To a great extent, at the cost of sidelining the discourse from a lot of indigenous communities, and at the cost of exploiting immigrant women and children, right? Because borders are so porous. And you must have known about Feluni Khatun, right? Someone who died right at the border, Indo-Bangladesh border, and her body was so she was attempting to cross into Bangladesh because she was married there, and her clothes, her bridal clothes, got stuck in the fence, right, the thorny fence, and then someone, I actually forgot on which side, on which country's army, but she was shot by the security forces, and then blood started dripping from her body, and she died there. And her body was actually left hanging, and it was I think it happened in 2011, if I'm not wrong. So it's been 10 years now, and still today, it's important that you ask me this question, because even today we see that the burden of migration and the burden of citizen is always written on the bodies of women and children, right? So this is something that became very, very, symbolic, right? Reminding us,
Okay.
the perils or the burden of what it is to have to live between demarcated borders, right?
Mm,
But I think when it comes to migration, like, as I said earlier, like even in the context of United States, I've never even been there, but from the sort of literature that is
mm,
emerging from indigenous communities, uh, America is said to be the land of immigrants, right? Irish
mm,
American, Italian Americans have been said to be responsible for making America this
yes.
way, right? And then you have also, black servants, black people who were forced to work as
Mm,
slaves in the
mm,
plantations across United States. They were, transported into the United States through something known as the Atlantic slave trade, which
mm,
is so symbolic of how migration, racialization, and oppression, white capitalism, how all of them came together. So I think,
mm,
like, it's a good question about migration, because talking about migration in itself brings up so many questions, right?
mm, mm,
And when it comes to migrants from different states, different communities of the region, I think it's not only just about finding a job. It's not only about getting a place to study here. It's also about finding out how the nation sees you. It also
mm,
is about how your community sees you, right?
mm,
Is the same way in which community treats you at home, or how it is with you back home in Nagaland? Is it the
mm,
same amongst the other the Chakesang Naga community in Bangalore, right? What
mm,
are the dynamics there? So I think more than the travel and more than the logistics and everything, it's much more to do with relationships. It's much more to do with your history, right, of the kind of
mm,
background you come with, and taking all of those into account, how you find the new city, how you adapt to it. So I
mm,
think, yeah, I mean, the thing about me is that I don't have any conclusive answers. All I can perhaps talk about are some interconnections and
mm.
relationships and
But
overlaps.
mm,
Yeah,
I do got your point, the point that you are trying to make. Like, it looks like migration. When we think of migration, the cause of migration may not necessarily because of the jobs or because of the
yeah,
educations,
yeah,
but
yeah,
because of the relationship we build. Right. That may be one of the major cause of migration.
yeah, yeah,
But
exactly. And also, like if I can add to it, see, even when you get a job or when you are sort of surrounded by people who support you in a new place, but
mm,
you may have concerns about your mental health. You may have concerns about your parents back home, right? About,
mm,
like, what is happening to the harvest, or what is happening to, maybe your aging grandmother or your grandfather back home, or your siblings who are still in school. So in a
mm,
way, I think we are migrants, but then we are also people who are somewhere located in between the
mm,
region and the country, and we can't place ourselves anywhere permanently.
mm.
We are in those what you say, gaps, basically.
Mm, mm. So,
Yeah,
in terms of, see, when we like when for now, you and me, we migrate to a new city, a new place,
yeah,
specifically for to study, to seek better educations.
right,
But can we also talk about the migrant workers, especially people
right,
who don't find job in their home state or in their home city, but they travel to different country, they travel to different state for job. If
yeah,
we see the overall in the Indian context, so many Indian, they travel to America, they travel to North America, they travel to Europe
yeah,
for better
yeah,
job opportunities. And just like that, even in India itself, say people from Northeast or people from some few of the states that are not well developed, they travel to Delhi, they travel to Mumbai, they travel to Bangalore for work. Right.
yeah.
So can we also talk about discuss what this is causing the society and what benefit the society is getting, or what is causing them to do all these things?
Okay, so I mean, I must be honest. I haven't engaged with migrant workers as much as I have engaged with, people who are currently engaged in pursuing higher education. But one thing I can say is, I have read Donny Keegan and Bengt Beppe Carlson's book, and then there is some work done by Remangam Marchang, who is a Tangkhul Naga scholar. And then you also have Duncan Magruda's work. Then there is Hoini Helik Situlho, who have,
Mm,
and then there is also Thangol and Kipgen from Manipur, who have tried to understand these questions, and they have tried to engage with their communities or other communities to understand what is the push and pull factor in terms of employment.
mm,
Uh, so I think based on the reading of their work, I can say that there is all of us, we know in the Northeast unemployment is still you know it's still low in comparison to employment uh, generation in the northern states, or
mm,
in states, or more particularly in states like Delhi, Punjab, or Maharashtra, or Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, right? And like interestingly, in the year 2012, there was a
mm,
huge exodus of
mm,
migrant workers from Bangalore, from
mm,
Karnataka, who were rushing to trains, buses, airports, and you could, and I think I still remember the pictures and everything. And the thing about I think that what really struck me from these studies, and after talking to a few of them, was the precarity.
mm,
See, I think Ben Carlson, Dolly Kicken, and Duncan McDonough talks about the appeal of a northeastern face in terms of finding opportunities, employment opportunities in restaurants that serve a certain type of a cuisine, or in
mm,
beauty parlors, or in spas, right?
mm,
Especially in the private sector consumption industry.
mm,
Uh, and they have very beautifully also sort of talked about the precarity in sense that they are replaceable in their workplace.
mm,
And how they can also be someone who can who have to sort of face adverse conditions. And this
mm,
is I think the something that even uh, I think migrants from across the region face, right? Because there are linguistic barriers, there are barriers in terms of qualifications, right? So I think when it comes to push and pull factors, there are so many.
mm,
But I would say that Bengt Carlson as well as Dolly Kicken's work called Wayfinding, there they have also beautifully shown how despite having to work, they are also like work almost 10 to 12 hours in a day. They are also very linked to what is happening back home, right?
mm,
So even though for a lot of us, we would assume that once we come out of the region, our roots get tethered, or like we are no longer rooted to our land. But that
mm,
was not the case in their work. So I think, see, workplace experiences are something that I have not worked on and I can't comment on it. But definitely, I can say that within their, the employment sector, there is,
mm,
at least within Assam, I can say that apart from working in small industries or government jobs,
mm,
which again are very few, it's very difficult for people to find employment. For privileged people like me, or someone like you, who sort of course mostly me, for privileged people like us, we perhaps look at it from a very different perspective.
mm.
But I also sort of know that people hold 2 3 jobs at one time to try to make ends meet, right? So this is something that I would say. But yes, to be honest, my knowledge on the employment sector or the push and pull factors are is definitely a bit limited. Yeah.
Mm, mm. That's a wonderful insight. Can we also talk about the racism or the discriminations that is happening across the country and even across the world? Of course, I personally, I have never faced any discriminations while living here in the city of Bangalore for the past 5 years, because every people I met in the last 5 years have been so good to me. But I always hear the news, or whenever I see the news, sometimes I see people getting discriminated uh, just because they are from a different community from Northeast, right? So can we also talk about discriminations, racism, and adding to that, I would also like to talk about the Asian hate movement that is currently happening in United States and the Europe,
Yeah,
right? Because
yeah,
that because after the corona, after the COVID pandemic, the Asian hate is getting so much that people are
yeah,
getting killed, people are getting beaten up, even in the open daylight in New York or
yeah.
across the United States, right? So can we also talk about those discriminations and racism that is happening across the country and across the world?
Yeah, like It's a very interesting question, but to be honest, I'm not sure if I'm the right person to talk about it, even though I'm engaged with it. See, before talking about racism, I think there is a little bit about the region that I would want to talk about.
Sure.
Uh, see, a lot of scholars, Sanjeev Barua, and recently there was this one article by Chitra Ahentham from Manipur in Scroll, which I read,
Mm,
who have sort of raised questions about the term Northeast because
mm,
it does away with all differences and all the unique specific cultural traits that are there with the different communities, with different ethno-linguistic communities. So in a way, they question: Is it even fair to use the term Northeast, right? Because that is how we are identified as.
mm,
Um, and then I think to a great extent, when a lot of people from the region migrate to outside, and especially during COVID, as you rightly pointed out, in Delhi itself, a lot of people were the subject of intense racialization, right?
mm,
And then there was this one student in North Campus, right next to where I lived. There was a man who sort of spitted on her, who spat on her when COVID came up, right?
mm,
And then there was some police action initiated against the perpetrator. So yeah, so I was saying, so when we talk about racialization, I think the most important references that I should give here was Weipau's book, Waiting
mm,
for the Dust to Settle, where he talks about where the protagonist of his book migrates to Delhi, and then he finds so many differences coming from a place like Senapati in Manipur. And then, there are certain activists like Richard Kame, whose work I really like and whom I really admire. And these scholars have also been talking about how even food, different cultures of food and
mm,
culinary choices that people from the again the specific states and communities make are restricted when it comes to consuming them in Delhi, right?
mm,
And then even Dolly Kicken's work on the I think you will know better, the akhone, the food, uh,
mm,
how it sort of causes contentions amongst different people in Delhi. So in a way, I feel that racialization now has extended not just to discrimination on the basis of your physical features, but also sort of restricting your choices in terms of what you wear, how you speak Hindi, right?
mm,
And how you sort of what kind of food you can have in Delhi, right? Like
mm,
say for instance, if a person from Manipur wants to carry akhuni
mm,
in his office to for lunch to his office, right? Or bekantu, I think it's called bekantu. If they are supposed to be carrying it, maybe there is a chance that maybe uh, people won't mind or no one's going to question them. But what do you think is going to happen in such a situation, right? So
mm,
I think in a way there is, say, racialization, I would link it to citizenship and say that there is a deficiency there. And the fact that for a long time caste-based issues, which
mm,
again rightly so, caste-based issues sort of took the attention away from issues of racialization as well. And then you do have the MP Baseboro report that came up in
mm,
2014 to sort of tackle racism. But then, there is a paper by Papuri Bora, who teaches at JNU, who says that the committee ignores the history of the region as well as the relationship that is there with the center, and
mm,
also it's very inconsiderate to a certain extent because the
mm,
burden is again on us to speak Hindi, to wear something appropriate and things like that. But it was nonetheless a step in recognition of
mm,
racial discrimination. If food is restricted or if speaking Hindi is a must, then we still need to, question
mm.
what exactly, and if citizenship is problematic, then how do we look at racialization, right? But this is a conversation that I think should also be had with people whose lived experiences, can tell you more about these experiences. Perhaps I'm still an outsider in this
Mm,
regard.
mhm. I
Yeah,
mean, like if we see in that point of view, almost everything boils down to our culture, our history,
yeah, yeah,
and like see who we are, our identity as
yeah.
people from this particular region.
Right.
So, like, can we talk more about how our culture, the culture from these regions, the history from these regions, and people from these regions are different. Like this region, in sense, the Northeast region, right? So how this culture, how their culture, how our culture, and how our histories, and how we as people identify ourselves as separate from the other part of the country. Like, can we also talk about that too?
Right. See, when we talk about difference or being
Mm,
separate, that in itself is also a very important category, because difference, how you articulate difference, is
mm,
something which is very, very important. And I think, even though a lot of people would say that, we should all be one nation, something like that, I am really against that idea, because when you pay attention to difference,
mm,
you also get to know privilege. You also get to know how power is structured, right?
mm,
Like, say for instance, in my case, or for any student from the Northeast, I think for us, um, just being called a Northeasterner is
mm.
not fair enough, right?
Okay.
Because see, again, it depends on who is the student we are talking about, right? See, see, if someone calls me a Northeasterner, of course I identify it because I come from the region.
Mm,
But then, coming from an Assamese community, which is again a very diverse community, right? There are
mm,
also caste-based, class-based differences, but then we also have a movement of, fighting for defending our language, right?
mm,
Against the imposition of another language. And then we also have had movements, where we sort of questioned, why are we even with India, right?
mm,
And
mm,
then we had student unions here who said that, tesdim telnidu, which is like, we are going to give our blood, we are not going to give our oil. And that is something which reminds you of how we interpreted power structures, right? How
mm,
we talked about it. But then, see, within Assam, I think caste-based Assamese community, at least the sort of positionality that I am from, we
mm.
are still sort of, our discourse has been at the forefront of the region, right?
Okay.
There are many other communities within Assam, and but there is a difference in terms of
Mm,
which discourse or which narrative gains more
mm,
importance, right? And obviously, there are huge changes now, as power in Assam in itself has changed, right?
mm,
So I would say that we are different from the rest of the country, but there is also
mm,
a lot of diversity amongst ourselves.
mm,
Obviously, in a utopian or in a glorious day, those differences amongst the region that exists within us, those differences should not exist. But
mm,
then, if they do not exist, then you wouldn't know which community is more privileged and which community still has to struggle to bring their narrative to our attention, right?
mm,
Whether
mm,
it is about coal mining in Meghalaya, right, or whether it is about one community's fight for autonomous district, right?
mm,
I think difference is something which sort of attracts our attention to something
mm,
that is lacking, right? So, of course, I'm not glorifying it. I'm not saying that there should be conflict in society, but I think as a social science researcher, I also feel that if people don't talk about their uniqueness, or
mm,
how they consider themselves separate from another community. Like, say for instance, in different communities we have clan-based
mm,
classification, right? And for some, clan identities are also important. But why do they get that importance? We have Bibles for every clan, right? We
mm,
have different small organizations, whether it is a student body or a church fellowship, or a big organization representing that community. We still have these organizations sort of serving or sort of bringing forward a different narrative. But why was the need of these organizations in the first place, right? So
mm,
if we start thinking about these questions, we see that there are differences, and how and why these differences become important is something that we need to think about first, I think. Then we
mm,
can sort of understand how this difference works, in terms of being different from India. Because see, difference here is at two levels, amongst
mm,
ourselves, in terms of clans, in terms of community, in terms of dialects, and then how each community feels they are different from India. A
mm,
region as a whole, we can't feel we are different from India as a whole. We can feel
mm.
different only when we think about our different layers of our identities, right? So I think, yeah, I'm
So
sorry, it's a very complicated, yeah, answer, yeah.
yeah, I understand that, but I mean, thank you for that insight. I feel like I want to ask you. I want to ask you this question. Like, do you think
Yeah.
we are still writing the history, or do you think our history is already completed?
No, I think history is being made and remade every single moment, every single
Mm,
second, to be honest. But that's the way it should be, right? History is something that should be created, it should be contested, it should be debating.
mm,
If if you sort of, you know, come up with a history that is accepted by all or that will not change, then it becomes very stagnant. And
mm,
communities are very dynamic entities, right? And so are their histories.
mm.
So I think history is being remade every single moment by very different people, right?
Then, do you
Yeah.
think our history, the history of the Northeast, do you think our history is still very young, or do you think our history has reached the maturity level?
Firstly, I don't think there is a history of Northeast. History of Northeast is something that is a history of convenience, right?
Mm,
It's something that was made by colonial officers, by after independence,
mm,
officials from probably other parts of the country, and you had officials from pre-existing provinces like Assam,
mm,
right? Who sort of, in order to you know, for administrative convenience, they sort of made the entire province into one region, right?
mm, mm,
Those aftermaths, those consequences, we are still suffering even today, right? And then you have people like David Zoe, who writes about headhunting, right? How headhunters from different communities of Northeast India sort of were made to be civilized,
mm,
right? And so that they could be taxed, right? So that they could aid the expansion of the empire, right? And so that they could not, obstruct access to natural resources for our colonial overlords. So I think, in a way, our history, to be honest, if I don't think there is any, but histories of communities have been obliterated. They have been, very much like homogenized, I would
mm,
say. So, because say, for instance, from archival research, I did some archival research, and I came across letters written by different community members,
mm,
who were then part of Undivided Assam, saying that we need recognition as separate communities so that our communities can get access to certain benefits, and so that our histories are not subsumed under larger nomenclatures.
mm,
And these are histories that a lot of students and a lot of activists, writers, even remember today, right? And that is why we commemorate the founders of certain communities every single
mm,
year, right?
mm,
So I think, to be honest, I don't think there is a history of Northeast, but there are histories which did question and challenge power structures, colonial power structures, and they continue to do even today. So I
mm,
think, if so, to give an answer, no, I don't think there's a history of Northeast. Um,
mm.
but there are histories, oral histories, folk histories, unwritten histories, histories of stories that originated in your mother's kitchen or in my mother's
Mm.
kitchen, right?
Can
And those are
we like talk
people.
about those things, like the unwritten histories, like
Yeah,
how different parts of Northeast they connect so well? Like if
yeah,
we see
yeah,
right now the Northeast part, or say
yeah,
the people from
yeah,
this region, the Nagas, we can connect with people from Meghalaya or Arunachal or Assam very well.
yeah,
And
yeah,
like historically, or say if we go back, like say some 100 years back, people from my state, or people from the part, the hillside, the hill people that is from my place, like
yeah,
they go to Assam, they go
yeah,
to the Assam Valley to buy salt or
yeah,
to do
yeah,
businesses, right?
yeah,
So let's talk about this unwritten history, or let's talk about this how the people of these regions build friendship across time,
yeah,
that even there today, right? So like
yeah.
share your insight on this.
Yeah, so I think, yes, it would be nice to talk about some friendships, right? Um, I think it's interesting because, to a great extent, um, from my experience, if I can talk about my experience, I found women, like during my ethnography, I found women uh, sharing with me and opening up with me about their lives,
Mm,
something that they couldn't really do with members of their own communities,
mm,
right? Because friendship in terms of community, if of course you will have you will have friendships with people with whom you can share your feelings in the same dialect, right?
Mm,
Or with whom you can consume food that reminds you of home. But
mm,
you will also, I think, being an outsider, I think I also sort of came across women who could share with me because I was not a part of their community, right?
mm.
And
Okay.
this is what I found very humbling, to be honest.
Mm,
Something that sort of made me aware of my status, of my position, right? As a woman, I think for us, one thing that I can say is that for us, friendships do matter, right?
mm,
Like I know for a fact that kitchens, because I come from a patriarchal setup. I think for us, kitchens are important because this is where women would spend a lot of time,
mm,
right? Because of the gender division of labor. And if someone from the community or someone from the neighborhood would drop into our homes, they would talk in the kitchen, right? And
mm.
they would
Yes.
share, they would share their concerns. They would share their hardships.
Mm,
If their children are staying outside of Assam, then and if they haven't received their call, how would it they become, right?
mm,
So I think, in a way, friendships, when people say that friendships are supposed to be organic or supposed to be spontaneous, it really is true,
mm,
because I think within our region, within our community, we find very unlikely friendships, like, say,
mm,
for instance, me connecting with someone from Nagaland like you, uh, was something which was unique because here we are both trying to come out of our bubble, right? We are
yes.
both trying to relate to one another. We are also trying to sort of get to know about our history, about the sort of background that we come from.
Mm,
And, that sort of is indicative of how friendships should be formed, right?
mm,
And of course, within the region, uh, borders are something that sort of restricted us, for legal official purposes. And
mm,
unfortunately, these were borders which were made by, again, colonial officers for the extension of the empire
mm.
without knowledge of these friendships, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, but and even after, whether it is after independence or whether after the different states that were carved out from Assam and after independence in Northeast, we still do continue having friendships, right?
Mm, mm,
And irrespective of our difference, I think to a certain extent, people from Northeast do connect with one another. In my perspective, I connect with people from the region more than people from outside. So, yeah, I think for me, friendships are phenomena, or they are relationships that do transcend boundaries of gender, language, of borders, right?
mm,
And in a hypothetical situation, it would have been nice if I could have been able to speak at least 50% of the dialects that we have here. But the idea is to sort of find the way in which we can keep the conversation going, right?
mm,
So I think this is where friendships become important. But
mm,
yes, the kitchen, or in different households, the fireplace,
mm,
those places are also places where friendships come into existence. And
mm,
Esther Kire, Mamang Dai, Avino Kire, Sentilong Ozokom, these are scholars and writers from the region who have talked about these friendships,
mm,
organic, spontaneous friendships. So,
mm,
yes, despite our differences, if we sort of become aware of our privileges, we can be friends, of course.
mm.
We do become friends. So I think this
Of
is,
course we are, yeah. So
yeah,
if like in that case, like
yeah,
kitchen, our kitchen where we
yeah,
take kitchen as a place for to meet new people, to discuss things, to eat food together, to have tea together, and a place for some people they even sleep in the kitchen. So
yeah, yeah,
it looks like kitchen play a very important role uh,
yeah,
to the people of this region, to us, right?
yeah,
So
absolutely.
like can we also talk about literature? While we have these oral stories, we have these folk tales, and
Mhm,
then the stories that are passed to us just
mhm.
in a way of communicating, in a way of
Yeah,
retelling those stories, right? But
yeah,
if we see in Northeast, many communities don't have a written literature. So many communities don't have a written language, right? They
right,
do
right.
speak a different language, but they don't have their own alphabet. They don't have their own a different set of characters in their literature, right? So can we also talk about this, how literatures are defined in our region?
I think language and literature is a very emotional subject to actually talk about, because not just because of the creative labor involved with producing, literature, but also because of the movements or the struggles that are there behind defending our own literature. And I think one of the best things about the oral or the folk narrative that emerges from the region is also that we challenge the written word, right? See, in terms of my personal thinking is the written word, or the written text, any text, whether it is a work of fiction or whether it is a historical work, any written work, it's a very westernized way of expressing yourself, to be honest, because in the West, preservation or archiving something for eternity is very important, right? Like, say for instance, I write a book and publish it, it's always going to be there, right? No matter how bad or how good it is, it's always going to be there, right? And it's there in text, nothing you can do is going to change it, right? But that's the problem. So when our elders, or when different community elders thought it best to express themselves through the oral word, it was also because they wanted to keep it dynamic. They wanted space for change, right? Because, say for instance, different communities within the Northeast, there are different origin myths, right? Like, say for instance, within the larger Chin Kuki Mizo nomenclature, there are different myths of how the Kuki community, originated, how the Mar community originated, or how the Paite community originated. And there are many different scholars, many different experts, linguistic experts from these communities have sort of recounted different ways of tracing your origin. That's because there wasn't any agreement on anything, right? They wanted to sort of, I think to a great extent, there had to be some sort of dynamism. But the thing about, and that's the thing about, of course, a lot of that stuff is now archived by a lot of people from within the communities, so that generations later can return to that material. But in a way, I think one also needs to question the importance of the written text over the oral or folk narratives. But again, to be honest, there are many scholars who are engaged in projects of transcribing oral or folk narratives. So I think to a great extent, this is the sort of work that has to come from within the community, right? Not outsiders, not privileged scholars. That work has to be done from people from within the community, so that they can understand why their elders sort of thought that folk or oral narrative could be something that could work, right? That could be, cherished by generations to come. And that is why it is so precious, right? So I think, in a way, when we talk about folk or oral narrative, we do need to question, why do written narratives become more important, to be honest? Yeah.
Totally get that. Shivangi, like, thank you so much for so many insight. Like, we do want to talk more, but we will continue. Maybe we will talk again later in the next podcast. But I still have just two questions, like from my side, like more about you. Like, you have been doing so much research, good stuff out there. I mean, reading and researching so many stories about us, about the history of our people. And so I want to ask you this question, like, what is your plan and what do you plan to do in life?
Okay, what do I plan to do in life? To be honest, that is a question that really scares me. But again, I'm also one of those people who is like an overthinker, right? Who just keeps thinking about this stuff and not do a lot to address them. But I think to a certain extent, the plan right now is to just keep engaging and see where it goes, But then I'm also currently, I'm also someone who's also battling a lot of confusions, conundrums, dilemmas. I'm someone who is thinking about my own identity, even though I come from the region, I'm sort of thinking, um, where do I where do I belong, right? In the midst of different students from different communities, what sort of a place that I have, right? Obviously, as researchers, we are people who curate narratives. We talk to people. We, transcribe those interviews. We publish them, and we make a career out of them, right? So you can understand how extractive our work is, right?
Got
Um,
it.
and that also of being of the privilege of hailing from one of the most, I wouldn't say that we are privileged, because within Assamese people there are so many differences, but hailing from a prominent community, and then coming from a elite educational background, what sort of relationship do I have with other students? Had this work been taken by someone from within the community, how different would it have been, right? So I think in a way, right now, I don't know if I'll be continuing in the same direction, but then I do want to keep engaging as much as I can.
Wonderful. So, if
Yeah.
you think of all these things, if you think of all this research work you are doing, kind of it helping the community in one way or the other, and also it's helping you to kind of find yourself, who you are, finding your identity. My last question is like, what is the meaning of all the work you are doing at the end of the day?
To be honest, I think this is a work that is really sacred to me.
Okay.
All the relationships, all the people that I have interacted, whether these are long-lasting friendships or whether it is interaction of just 5 minutes with someone over a cup of tea. I think for me, each of these conversations are very, very important. And I think through the research, I also sort of became a person who is more helpful, who is more open. Because I think one thing that I do want to share with your listeners is that I'm someone, because of my appearance, I have faced a lot of body shaming issues, a lot of body dysmorphia issues. So I think, and even today, that is something that I face, right? So I think in a way, when I sort of came across women from other communities facing something of the same magnitude, right? And then, obviously we come from different backgrounds, different lived experiences, different degrees of privilege. But still, there are certain issues over which we could connect. And those connections, I realized they were not there in my life, right? There were very few with whom I could talk about them. I think, despite being all of us being in very closed community networks, we still sort of gasp, we are still sort of looking for that air to breathe, right? Where we can be ourselves and where we can define, and where we don't need to define ourselves by anyone else's
Yes.
So I think that is something that, I do want to be a more confident person, and I do want to be a more humble and a more helpful person, and be there for other PhD students or other scholars from the region like myself. I don't know if I'll ever have the means to do that, but I definitely have the will to do that. So hopefully I'll find a way.
That's amazing to hear about you, to hear about all the insights you gave. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for doing all these things.
To me. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
We will talk again, maybe in the next podcast or something like that. Maybe we will talk again, because I think like we still have so many things to talk about.
I know.
Yeah.
I think these conversations are never ending, and they should never end.
Yes.
I think thank you for providing us the platform for these conversations.
It's a pleasure, yeah.
And you have been an amazing host, because I think you felicitated this conversation beautifully.
Thank you so
much. Yes.